No comment about.
Thanks, Philip, and thank you everybody for coming. Can you hear me if I talk like this? Is that pretty good? Yeah, so I was just joking with Annie, who did this amazing event that several of you were at down the street a few minutes ago, nicely grounded in a specific chapter of Volume 1 of Capital, Chapter 10, The Working Day, and Annie's presentation, for those of you. Oh, so a little sorry, yeah, I'm kind of looking at my screen already. Annie's presentation was so beautifully grounded in the history of the production of the text of that chapter, and so beautifully open to the contemporary political questions that chapter continues to invite us to rethink, that I spent much of my time listening to the conversation, thinking about how I might not be bringing the same equipment to this presentation, because I'm talking about just value, this vast, potentially infinite topic, not just in Marxism, but in a whole variety of discourses. The little blurb I jotted down for use on the Red Day schedule, if I remember it correctly, made me sound like a person who might kind of talk to you a little bit about the kind of secret passageways between seemingly very different domains of value, like value in ethics, value in aesthetics on the one hand, and economic value under capital on the other. And I continue to be interested in that set of questions and problems, and would be happy to talk about that if that's what you came here to hear. But it is also true that for me, in the background of thinking about those questions as a poet and a literary critic and someone who thinks about, art and cultural production, there's always for me another set of questions about the history and the dynamics of capitalism, such that we would even be thinking about, is X art object a commodity, or has it been commoditized, or the various kinds of questions we've been trained to ask ourselves when we talk about art culture. Behind that, and behind my thinking and writing about that, is some other stuff that I haven't written about as much, but have talked about with friends and students and comrades for some time now. So this is kind of like a little bit of a maiden voyage for me in trying to present a little bit of a thought that's back of the questions we ask ourselves about aesthetics and literature and seemingly economic and non-economic value divides. Someone asked me in the lobby if I was going to be talking about value theory. And I'm going to be talking about value, but not really value theory. So Annie was saying a little while ago that there are probably lots of people in the room who are very familiar with whole strands of conversation in Marxist thought, just coming to these rooms at Red May, and I'm assuming the same. You may therefore know that there is a pretty high-level, sophisticated conversation that's been going on in Germany and in German for the last 30 or 40 years, and it's been enjoying an accelerated translation into English over the last 10. And I'm not going to be talking about that, though I think that some of the things that are of interest to me around the question of value and value production in Marx relate to that, of course. And maybe in our conversation together, I can try to explain a little bit how and why. What other preliminary things do I want to say? Maybe not too much. I guess I want to talk about what I see as a new opportunity for a kind of conversation that would expand what Marxism is capable of. I see it developing around me. It would be a conversation or set of conversations where histories of racism and racialization, histories of colonialism, and histories of patriarchy could be seen to shape the history of the capitalism we've been trained to think of as a matter of industrial wage labor. So I see lots of small places all over, half connected, half not yet, for a flexible and capacious conversation that would start to see those things as part of a single complicated history. And that feels new and fresh and powerful to me. As someone who wants to talk about that with you, I will say that what I'm going to do is, I think of it as kind of like secretarial work, like I'm trying to compile a bunch of conversations and refer to them and give you maybe basic bibliographical pointers to those conversations. Again, I really know just next to nothing about which of any of those conversations you might already be very well versed in. But so what I'm going to do is try to develop a kind of basic insight that devolves for me from chapter 25 of volume 1 of Capital. So if this were a stricter Marxathon presentation, this would be a presentation kind of about chapter 25, whose title is in English, The General Law of Capitalist Accumulation. But I won't be doing what Annie just did, which was meticulously reading the text of the chapter itself and providing a history of how that chapter took its shape. I'm actually just going to refer to one fact about the shape of that chapter and one insight that I think is particularly important that can be drawn from that chapter, and then try to transpose that idea or use it to think about some contemporary stuff very briefly. And so the first part I want to say for just the next couple minutes is to get in and out of chapter 25. And then I have a kind of bullet-pointed list of, I think, 5 political conversations and theoretical conversations that seem potentially either reshapeable or in the midst of being reshaped by something like this insight that I think is particularly vivid in chapter 25. So, I think that as Marxists, let's say that we're in this room, we're all Marxists, we're comfortable with at least 2 basic ideas about value production. One, that capitalist accumulation is driven by the surplus value derived from exploitation, and just got an amazing account of the particulars, like the granular particulars of the way the working day functions in this regard, is the engine of all that. So the accumulation is driven by the surplus value derived from exploitation. And 2, this is a thing that humanist Marxists in particular are always having to remind people of quantitative bents of mind, that value is a social relation and not a quantitative matter that can be simply expressed, for instance, as a price. So we all, I think, are partly because of the value theory conversations that have been happening, partly because of the politics of financial booms and busts over the last 10 years, much more articulate, whether we're theoreticians or academics or people on the street, about the differences between value and price, whether or not we know always that that's exactly what we're talking about. But those 2 things seem like something a lot of us who read Marx and think about Marx and are Marxists would have under our belts. Surplus value and exploitation and the social relationality and not the merely quantitative character of value. But then there's this third thing about value production that I'd like to talk about for the next little while, which is that historically, capitalism has developed as much by excluding and expelling populations from the wage as by dragooning them into it. And that's the thing that I think engines much of the most interesting conversation around kinds of political struggle and kinds of ways of reading capital and reading them in and out of the Marxist tradition that are most exciting to me right now. So a history or a practice of learning how to tell ourselves a history in which exclusion and expulsion from the wage have as central a role to play as people being dragged into the wage relation. So I just mentioned something along these lines, but if I were offering a slightly different kind of talk today, I'd walk us through this idea as it gets developed in chapter 25, the general law of capitalist accumulation. In that chapter, Marx develops an argument about how the organic composition of capital, OCC, for those who read this text a lot, that is the value ratio between means of production and labor power. You could think of it as machines and people, sort of that. Marx develops an argument about how the organic composition of capital shifts with the tides of intercapitalist competition, always tugged in the direction of more efficient production, more efficient machinery, which means that the production process tends to involve, as it gets machined, less profitably exploitable human labor. And this is one place where I see, a joint between what Annie was talking about in such great detail a couple hours ago or an hour ago, and what I want to kind of gloss in a synoptic way here. So she detailed for you a little bit, for those of you who were there, that kind of Achilles heel of that contradiction by which intercapitalist competition drives the production process towards ever more machinic and technological efficiency, but thereby expels the very source of its profitability, which is exploitable, underpayable labor. Because this expulsion of labor power from the production process is also the expulsion of the source of that process's profitability, capitalists have to maintain that profitability in a range of other ways. And some of these, of course, Annie was touching on a little bit earlier as well, from finding new markets to pushing wages as low as possible. There's a variety of other related ways we could talk about this. David Harvey, of course, talks about the spatial fix, the differentiated ways we can keep wages up in one place if we're a capitalist class, literally at the price of suppressing them more violently elsewhere. Anyway, this dynamic around intercapitalist competition and the stress on the organic composition of capital is why, in the second half of chapter 25, Marx shifts from a discussion of those pressures to his famous account of the reserve army of labor, or the reserve army of the unemployed. In this section of the chapter, he provides a schematic description of negative relations to the wage, what he calls, and this is again our English translations, what he calls stagnant, latent, and floating reserves, as well as a brief account of sheer pauperdom, or lumpenness. This set of smaller groups, together known as the relative surplus population, is the product of a dynamic of exploitation by which capitalists continually try to reduce the number of workers they employ and create, in the process, a population of formerly and intermittently exploitable people. Marx closes out chapter 25 with a brief empirical analysis of gang labor in English agricultural. And so he's talking about the inventive ways that capitalist classes are able to distribute exploitable labor among varying numbers of people using kinds of labor organization. And then he turns finally to a brief discussion of impoverishment in his day in Ireland. But I don't think it's too hard to see how we might expand the frame of Marx's analysis to think about capitalism's global dynamics, for instance, as well as about the household arrangements that have accompanied the rise of the wage relation. For me, this is where the rubber hits the road in 2018. If the revival of interest in Marx after the 2008 financial crisis first tended to lead us to try to understand financializations and the contradictions of the money form, it was very soon accompanied by a revival of interest in aspects of the Marxist tradition that had lain understudied for decades, not least the political and intellectual work of Black and anti-colonial Marxists and of Marxist feminists. Returning to this work and bringing it into contact with a range of contemporary Marxist thinkers, especially very young ones, is providing us an opportunity to develop a stronger, more flexible account of capitalist history and capitalist violence, one that takes into account the waves of struggle since 2008, which range, of course, from the most famous, like Occupy and Black Lives Matter, and DAPL and Me Too, as well as conversations around things that we touched on a little bit earlier as well, like universal basic income, robotization, and the current conversation about job guarantees. It goes without saying that this more robust Marxism, one that keeps exclusion from the wage in a close relation to compulsion to work, could also help us think about processes of environmental degradation as well, since the waste products of capital are the sources of that degradation, just as the populations capital lays wastes to are the objects of its indifference. So talking to Philip yesterday in that cafe bakery, I said that though I felt weird about the metaphor, I do sense a kind of Manhattan project, a Marxist Manhattan project in the works, where we're beginning to move past old divisions to create a larger framework. Older divisions between a Marxism that tended to see capital through the lens of a very narrow version of class, on the one hand, and a range of social movements, including so-called identity movements, on the other. Movements that rightly suspected this older Marxism of deprioritizing struggles outside the industrial workplace, or worse, of taking the wrong side in struggles around race and gender and coloniality. To be blunt, I think the rising superfluity of the kinds of labor that built global middle classes is affording an opportunity to see links between different moments in the history of capitalist exploitation now. The onset of our irrelevance to capital could and should make us take notice of the history of the shaping of other relative surplus populations long before us. To be even blunter, I think we can get beyond not only the limits of a parochial white guy Marxism in 2018, but also beyond the theory of intersectionality if we begin to see the ways in which we have a common enemy. So what would this 21st century Marxism look like? What is it starting to look like? I want to take the remaining minutes I have where I'm giving a monologue to bullet point 5 conversations where I see action happening along these lines. Conversations about racial capitalism, about Marxist feminism and social reproduction, about primitive accumulation and settler colonialism, about geopolitics and international relations, and about robotization, universal basic income, technology, and job guarantees. All these conversations are potentially linkable, I think, by the dynamics of simultaneous inclusion and expulsion from the wage Marx describes in a variety of places, but most vividly, I think, in chapter 25. So this is where I'm going to get a little bit bullet pointy, and as I mentioned, I'm going to just try to describe what I take to be a kind of pivoting in a range of conversations, maybe suggest to you some places where, if you're not already deep into those conversations, you can begin to go to see what's happening. So number one is conversations around race and capitalism. And before I get into the very brief detail I'll go into here, I'll just say that in several of the cases, maybe even all of these 5 cases, what I'm partly seeing is a simultaneous return to a text or set of texts that had kind of lain dormant, as I mentioned a few moments ago, and the production of new work that sometimes is coincidentally returning to old problems without awareness of that older work or reviving that older work itself. So there's a lot of just like lived experience, surely in this room and in Seattle and in places that I know, like DC, the Bay Area, of making PDFs of stuff that's been fallen out of print, circulating, creating readers, reading practices where you start out reading a volume or chapters of Capital, and then you gradually realize that you want to expand what you're reading to pursue lost and semi-lost material from the Marxist tradition. There's a lot of interesting just human activity around the recovery and amplification of writing going on right now. So anyway, with regard to the conversation and the way I think it's shifting around racial capitalism, part of that is triggered by a revival of interest in Cedric Robinson's 1983 book, Black Marxism. And for those of you that don't already know the book, you can get a quick hit on how that book is enjoying a contemporary reactivation by going to the Boston Review, which had a forum, maybe I actually think in 2017 and 2018, twice already, it's returned to that book and gotten some contemporary scholars, including people like Peter James Hudson and Donna Murch, to talk about Robinson's racial capitalism. So there's the revival of a particular kind of text there, which is trying to think about, of course, as you might imagine, the relationship between the Atlantic slave trade and the history of capitalism. I should say also that as I move very quickly to a description of how these conversations are changing and accelerating, there is literally no way I could go into the history of the debates that have gotten these conversations to this point in each case. So you're lucky, I hope, to have me spare you that. But as a scholar, I feel this guilt and embarrassment that I'm glossing over like huge conversations and a whole range, in every case, of very sophisticated nuanced differences of opinion. I'm just going to move kind of fast here. But I'm doing it, again, in the service of saying that I think there's something where if we go we don't even have to get in a helicopter and do it, but just like look a little bit up, we can begin to see how these conversations are potentially connectable. So that's why I'm going to be a little bit reductive. So, at the center of the conversation that's been revived around Race and Capitalism is a story about capitalism and slavery. Some people like to talk about that in terms of whether we could ever tell a story about the profitability of slavery. There are arguments that it was the opposite of profitable, and that was why capitalism was able to come in that story, which is a kind of capitalist triumphalist story. Capitalism humanizes labor relations by taking particularly violent aspects of domination off the page. That's part of what Annie was talking about in terms of academic conversations about the differences between domination and exploitation. Sometimes quietly in those conversations that want to make that be a difference, capitalism gets a free pass because exploitation always sounds better than domination. What's interesting, though, about this very complex and nuanced and really empirically driven conversation in particular about the Atlantic slave trade and the history of capitalism is the beginnings of a movement away from something like a governing question that was along the lines of, were slaves workers or not? And in place of that, we get to something else, or we're beginning to get something else, that's a little bit closer to an understanding of the dynamics of compulsion and exclusion from the wage that we see in Chapter 25 in Capital. A new attention to the histories of the exclusion of black people from labor populations and labor pools, histories of redlining, for instance, as in the recent and fascinating work of Nathan Connolly, and a return to the history not only of slavery, but of Reconstruction, and a history of the consolidation of that three-way political arrangement, only two pieces of which ever seem to get talked about in mainstream media, but it's that three-way politics that centers on the tug between a white capitalist class, poor whites, and black people. And so white working class partly always feels ambivalent and schizophrenic and incoherent because it won't talk about the devil's pact that's made between the capitalist class and those people, which begins to take its modern shape in the era of Reconstruction. So one of the things that is beginning to tug the conversation about racial capitalism away from this question, like a categorical question, were workers slaves? Yes, they were, no, they weren't. In what sense, sorry, that's a question that Marx asks. Were slaves workers? Yes, no, yes, kind of, sort of, yes, no. And you can dance on the head of a pin with that question and produce interesting thought and interesting history with that question for a while. But there's something else that's also going on around this question that feels quite different now, because it's beginning to think about the politics of exclusion from the wage. Or, in historical terms, what we might think of as like post-exploitability, a moment in history after which the population which you form part is not worth exploiting anymore. So you end up, say, in the prison industrial complex. The history of exclusion from the wage, that is to say, or post-exploitability, links work like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow from 2010, or Ruth Wilson Gilmore's The Golden Gulag from 2007, to newer scholarship like Nathan Connolly's, and I think it can help make sense of aspects of racism that center on the radical devaluation of black bodies and black lives in the way that has become familiar to us in a kind of progressive humanist vein in Black Lives Matter discourse and in a kind of philosophical vein for those who track these things in so-called Afro-pessimism. So I think, anyway, there's something interesting going on there. That was one of 5. I'll try not to take too much longer. 2, Marxist feminism and social reproduction theory. As with studies of race and capitalism, I think there's a very interesting revival right now going on of interest in older feminist work and a flowering of new projects that's beginning to dovetail with that older work. A new autonomedia collection edited by Silvia Federici has collected key writing from the Wages for Housework movement in the 1970s, to just take one data point. Even before that collection was published, in, again, many of the cities that I visit or have friends in, reading groups were forming and readers were being made at PDS to bring some of this work back into circulability. But anyway, there's this new collection of writings edited by Federici from Wages for Housework, which at its most radical wanted to call the question of the unwaged support women's reproductive labor gave to the wage relation by making a deliberately unfulfillable demand that work be paid. So as in some of Federici's writing in the period, literally to break the money form, right? Because you say, like, well, you can't actually pay for reproductive labor because you can't pay everybody for everything. You would break capitalism. That's sort of the point. But there is also a range of new work that builds on this earlier feminism, much of it under the banner of a revived interest in social reproduction more broadly. And there's a fascinating and really powerful new book by a scholar named Laura Briggs called How All Politics Became Reproductive Politics that just got published sometime in the last 12 months. That is really interesting for the seemingly different kinds of political struggle that it's actually able to connect into a single narrative. So I really recommend Laura Briggs' work in this regard as well. As with work on racial capitalism, this newer conversation promises to move away from asking whether, as in an earlier wave of feminism, women are in some sense of class, or whether reproductive labor is categorically like or unlike waged industrial labor. Is domestic work waged work in some categorical way? Definitively yes or no. And toward a framework, again, in every instance I'm going to be talking about a move away from a categorical framework in some sense and towards something that's more historical and harder to line out on either side of the ledger, yes, no. So away from that and towards a framework that sees both capitalism's need to keep some kinds of labor outside the wage, as well as a dynamic in which the much touted profitability of the tech sector, for instance, is built on the feminized hyper-exploitation of low organically composed labor elsewhere, often in the global south. So, feminists, I think, were hip to this very early on in an otherwise highly theoretical essay from 1985 called Scattered Speculations on the Theory of Value. Gayatri Spivak points out, not only is she already talking about telecommuting and the internet in that 1985 essay, which is amazing, but she's pointing out that for every, what would it have been in 1985? I don't even know which Apple computer it was. I got my first one the following year. For every one of those that's made and makes some worker's job cool and easy and kickback and telecommutable, there is someone, usually a woman, somewhere else, today it's in the Congo, mining coltan with her bare hands. That said that the idea that I wanted to talk about wasn't super complicated, and that's another one of those ideas that's actually, if we're willing to pay attention to it, just not super complicated. It's just painful to take as seriously as it needs to be taken, and that's different from intellectual complication. Anyway, a move away from a categorical question, are women a class, yes or no, is reproductive labor, yes or no, towards something else. That's about the history of the unwaged support to the wage that household members and family members, gendered as women, have provided. Federici's work, of course, in the Cowband and the Witch being central to that conversation. The only other thing I would say before moving on is that she uses a really interesting phrase, the production of differences, which is about the beginnings of the way that we draw a divide, if we're a capitalist class, an emerging capitalist class, between the inside and the outside of the wage relation. And beyond that, how capitalism produces differential negative relations to the wage as per the reserve, or the different strata or subgroups in the reserve army of labor. And I think that is another way of getting at what is so interesting about Chapter 25, and the way it potentially can link seemingly different political conversations, is an attention to there not just being one single non-wage relation of poverty, but a whole variety of diagonal and intermittent, and use your spatial or temporal metaphor, relations to the wage that aren't full-time industrial employment. So Federici's central here. Okay, 3, primitive accumulation and settler colonialism. This is a really fast-moving conversation, and I feel least equipped to gloss it for you in the way that I'm about to try. But there's a very important conversation going on right now, parts of which I remember hearing pieces of in this room last year where, for instance, Christian and Ike O'Day sat here and got all of us up to speed on aspects of this really powerful shift in the politics of thinking about settler colonialism, indigeneity, and primitive accumulation. So there's something really important going on, and part of it's happening right here when people come to talk about it. Primitive accumulation, of course, when we're being meticulous about how Marx talked about it, is so-called primitive accumulation. That is, the forms of violent expropriation whose primitiveness lies less in early forms of thriftiness by proto-capitalists, as in Adam Smith's story of the rise of capital, than in the primitivity of a capitalist class's willingness to destroy lifeways in order to expand. The state of play around primitive accumulation debates has been, for almost 2 decades, a kind of standoff between an orthodox reading that sees primitive accumulation as having happened once in medieval Europe and maybe once in each of a set of other places on the globe as capitalist relations expanded. So on the one hand, a more orthodox reading, it happens one time, maybe once and for all, or one time in each place, whatever a place is, on the one hand. And a more capacious sense of something like ongoing primitive accumulation. This is kind of spearheaded by David Harvey. He tries to shift the terms to something like what he calls accumulation by dispossession. He does that in the early 2000s. But it seems to me that as with those other conversations where we get into a kind of yes-no framework, did primitive accumulation happen once? Is it always happening? Is it eternal and recurrent, or was it punctual? There's something going on that's going to, if we pay attention to it, give us the tools to move away from that. So recent work in indigenous and settler colonial studies, as well as in Marxist studies of ecology, which is partly what I think makes this really interesting as a nexus of conversation, suggest a way beyond this standoff. In different ways, work by people who I think just been here, like Nikhil Singh, Glenn Coutard, Ike O'Day, suggests that the forms of violent dispossession that capital requires in order to establish new markets can function to produce not just new consumers or new workers. That is to say, there's an expansion model of primitive accumulation, and what it does is create more places where there's more capitalism and more capitalist types of people. But also new forms of what, for capitalist purposes, are unwageable populations, populations that capitalism wouldn't want to see turned into exploitably wageable, or wageably exploitable. Meanwhile, work like Jason Moore's Capitalism and the Web of Life. Has Jason Moore come here for Red May? Or, yeah?
Next year.
Next year, all right, okay. Work like Jason's Capitalism and the Web of Life. Have folks read that book or dipped into that book? It's a really interesting book. Suggests that capital accumulation requires not just the expansion of commodity production spatially, temporally, over the face of the globe, but also the reproduction of what he calls cheap nature. Nature that, by definition, has to remain outside commodification if it's to keep the costs of production low. And this is a kind of chapter 25 insight, I think. So once again, a return to the dynamics of what's outlined in chapter 25 in a very different set of conversations can help us see the links among different kinds of struggle, just as, you know, something concrete outside of our readings of Marx, like pipeline activism, has forced those linkages really into view. So environmental struggle, struggle over historical lifeways, struggle over pre-capitalist forms of social relation, a whole variety of kinds of political struggle can be seen to intersect quite vividly, whether or not you're theorizing it in something like No Dabble. Okay, for geopolitics. In the case of studies of international relations and geopolitics, Marxists have been returning for a while now to a more recent body of work that got sidelined for a little bit, work by people like Giovanni Arrighi and Robert Brenner, for accounts of the relationship between capital and the international system of nation states. But where, in different ways, Arrighi and Brenner have focused on the question of how crises in profitability arise from contradictions internal to the circuit, MCM prime, right? That most basic schematization of how surplus value gets created and how capital accumulation happens, through which we go from making, we start with money and we end up with more money through the crucible of commoditization. Where, in different ways, Arrighi and Brenner have focused on how we can develop a theory of crisis, partly historical and partly schematic, by leaning on MCM prime, the dynamics internal to it, how hard it is to get stuff to market in just the right amount of time, crises possibly deriving from realization, debates we might have about how crises happen because of overproduction or underconsumption. In Arrighi's account, crises that come with the accumulated weight of trying to internalize costs if you're a certain hegemon. It's a different story in Brenner. But what they share is an attempt to read out their theory of crisis and historical transformation of capital as much as they can from within MCM prime, from within a historicized understanding of the dynamics internal to that circuit. Meanwhile, though, there's something a little bit different going on. It's a bit contentious. I should have said also that a lot of the thinkers I'm glossing, as you might imagine, I'll have incredibly interesting disagreements with each other, right? I'm making them sound like, everybody is moving forward with this single research project and getting along, but of course, that doesn't happen without really intense arguments. So, for example, scholars like J.R.S. Banerjee, in his book, in his career, but in his recent collection of essays, Theory as History from 2010, are asking us to expand our sense of capitalist profitability as depending on things like serfdom and peasantry in an ongoing present tense, as much as on the abolition of those things in a march towards wage exploitation. So that was an even more miniature version of an interesting shift I see in Marxist conversations around geopolitics. Radhika Desai is coming here next week, maybe?
Yeah.
And she's educated me tremendously in her 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy, about how some of these dynamics can work. And she pushes back really interestingly on Arrighi and Brenner's account of how capitalist crisis happens. So for somebody like Banerjee, there's an amazing, historically rich story to be told about forms of labor in the Byzantine Empire, in ancient Egypt, that can either look or not look like wage labor if we're not thinking too rigidly. And for somebody like Desai, focusing much more closely on the recent past, she has a really different way of talking about the politics of the dollar than just a story about financialization. And so for those people who get to hear her speak, I'm sure it'll be fantastic. But I would put her also in the zone of someone driving a new conversation about geopolitics that has as much to do with things forced outside MCM prime as about things dragooned into it. 5, finally, robotization, technical compositions of capital, universal basic income, job guarantees, all that cluster of stuff about how the robots, our robot masters, are going to make us obsolete. That's a conversation happening kind of in a weird parallel. It's a little bit different from all the other ones. It's happening in kind of a weird parallel or tandem between like Marxist worlds and like tech and finance bros about how and whether robots are going to replace us, as capitalism tries to outmaneuver the possibility of something like secular stagnation. But Annie was really great and succinct and powerful on this earlier today. There's this choose your mythological figure, Achilles' heel problem here, where technologization outmaneuvers stagnation in the short term, but worsens it in the long term. Since I'm running out of time, I'll just say that as with the other conversations I've outlined, I think there's an opportunity to move past a categorical divide. Are robots workers? Are workers robots? Are workers replaceable by robots? 2 columns, categorical debate. An opportunity to move past a debate like that has some of the same limits as the frameworks that ask whether women are slaves or workers in some traditional sense. Again, a look back to earlier scholarship and writing is proving helpful here, as in the essays of George Kofentzis. If any of you read George's work, he's really amazing on precisely this question about technology and value production. Kofentzis from around 1980 on was articulating a dynamic around oil, global infrastructures for energy, and finance that lay emphasis on the migration of profitability from low capital intensive sectors, that woman with coltan in her bare hands, to high OCC sectors, the cool dude designing a new interface for the Mac. So as to suggest that technology can't produce any value, of course, because surplus value-driven exploitation or exploitation-driven surplus value is doing that, but also because low and high capital-intensive sectors are inextricably linked. And the low end of capital-intensive labor power and labor exploitation is always on that border zone of the intermittently employable, the terminally employable, in ways that are really different from the kinds of employment itself becoming less secure in higher, more highly capitalized sectors of value production. So we could, again, look back to some earlier writing, but we could also hear the spirit of this work being revived and extended in new projects by thinkers like Jasper Burns, whose recent and astounding essay, The Belly of the Revolution, have any of you had a glance at this essay? Thinks through the likely unevenness of any use of capitalist technology in a transition to communism. And there, what he's doing to get around that categorical question is trying to extricate Marxist thinking from a debate that says, like, okay, technology. Some capitalist technology, good. Antibiotics, good. Some capitalist technology, nuclear weapons, bad. That's literally kind of like how he satirizes it in his Belly of the Revolution essay. There's something else that happens where if you shift the focus to either you could call it social reproduction or something like survival. How are we going to survive? How are we going to, eat and take care of each other and stay warm and communicate with people we want to communicate with in the chaos of a revolutionary transition to something beyond capitalism. So I highly recommend that essay. And it's in the spirit of earlier work that was itself trying to develop a kind of multi-pronged and less categorical understanding of the relationship between technology and capital, technology and value. So that's my synopsis. I feel like I took up way more time than I thought I was going to. All I wanted to say as a gloss here maybe was like two final things. It seems to me that, as always, a spike in capitalism's violence and brutality makes the links among its very different kind of tactics more visible for a while. We seem to be very much in that period right now, and that's one of the reasons I feel, not just in reading groups, but just out in the world, there are opportunities before us to experience as unignorable the links among very seemingly different kinds of struggle for survival. And I think that's an opportunity for us. We all struggle where we are, so this kind of reading and study I think is exhilarating but also potentially overwhelming because you suddenly feel like you have more opportunities or more obligations to oppose stuff, as so many of us feel these days, than we even thought there were. But I think that's okay. I think it's okay to feel overwhelmed. I also think that we can feel optimistic about one thing in this current cycle, is that it is, once again, increasingly difficult for the capitalist class's ability to hide. And I'll stop there.
Hey, I wanted to thank you for that. That was really great, Chris. It's a wonderful cognitive map of sort of capitalism and work around it now. The scientific research program that is hopefully a Manhattan Project where we get together and do it to that degree until we figure out how it works. And I think what I appreciated particularly was the way you framed the kind of impasses that capitalism is this or it's that. You know, it's slavery is capitalism or it's not. That had been kind of choking discussion for a long time, and kept showing what ways that new questions were being raised that put these antinomies in question. And I think that's. I think the answer is that the things that have happened, or one answer is that in the last 8 or 10 years, have kind of opened up and brought back elements of Marx theory that we thought dead, and shown that other ones are limited. It's clear, for example, that capital doesn't need wage labor to exist, and you know, once you outsource, well, wait, I mean, let me reframe it another way. It doesn't only need that; it needs sort of other things. It's able to use indentured servitude, slavery, and others at the other end of outsourcing. That's what I mean. I'm not saying it's eliminating the aid. And so that asks us to rethink the beginning of capitalism again.
I wish Annie were here because she, yeah. I mean, I feel like we because the class of people who constitute the fragments or factions of the capitalist classes make themselves invisible, we always end up saying capital, right? We anthropomorphize capital, I'm fine with that. But it seems that rather than literally getting rid of workers, capital is trying to figure out how to minimize the part of the recipe that is that you can't have capitalism without it, which is exploitable, surplus value-driven wage labor. But you try to make that as small a part of the recipe as possible because there's like only so much chocolate left in the world, or whatever do your analogy. But so sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah, but I guess that's it's experimenting with various combinations of what works and what not, and it seems that there's a lot more that works.
It's trying to make its Achilles heel as small as possible, but it will never go away as long as
of course, yeah. But it shows it's much more resilient than was predicted, where a simple falling rate of profit or something like that will bring it to an end. And I think that about the primitive accumulation debate, I think there's one more moment in that as to whether it's happened one time or it keeps happening in accumulation by dispossession and so forth, is the other strain that's brought in by Althusser and Jason Reed is the notion that capitalism is something that could just as easily not have happened. There's this element of contingency with all these things that had been around before, banking in Italy, wages and so on. They come together and something new emerges. So we want to keep that element, I think, in the mix too, as we're formulating this research program. But I think your 5 questions and the areas you identify as kind of wide areas of discussion and research are helpful in terms of pursuing these discussions.
Yeah, I'm trying hard to be a good secretary. and just as a little footnote to that, I will say that I'm no fan of Althusser. I'm a huge fan of Jason Reed.
Right.
And one of the things that you could say about the kinds of conversations, one of the things that seems interesting about the way we might link these conversations, say out of a reading of chapter 25, is how historical we need to be.
Right.
And how the kinds of thinking we want to do is theoretical in a deeply historical sense, and that's different for me than straight up philosophical, critical theory, philosophy. So Jason's point about the aleatory, or could have happened, might not have happened thing. I like that when Jason does it because he links it to such great stuff. In Althusser, that's linked to beautiful thoughts about the rain in Epicurus and stuff. But that's a different. That just gets.
Yeah.
It gets more inside the history of philosophy than I can.
And I do think, by the way, the Theory and History of Urbanity is a wonderful example of exactly the kind of how the research program. I'm trying to get sort of a reading group around that book going here,
really
because
amazing.
I think it really is a classic example of bringing together two traditions.
Totally. Yeah.
Thank you. That was interesting. I have a question just about the arc of what you were doing with this presentation. It seems like on some level the return to chapter 25 is meant to get us to think about the exclusion of populations and move towards a centering of disposability and unwaged labor, which for you creates an opening because it sort of moves us away from the worker wage question and opens up to questions of social reproduction. You gave us the list. So it means that it's a chapter that opens out, but then to characterize this as revival felt to me like not to create the intellectual genealogy within these 5 areas that gives credit to the work that's been done. For whom is it a revival? I mean, Eric Williams is writing Capitalism and Slavery back in the 30s. Du Bois writes in 35 his chapter on the black worker and black reconstruction. So, for many black radicals, that question of whether the slave was a worker or not was resolved. It was resolved, or it had a placeholder that was sufficient to move the theory on at that point already. So it's a revival for those that didn't track that argument in a certain kind of way and sort of newly imagine that there's a problem there because they were unable to think it prior. And I think it's the same with the feminist stuff. I mean, Frederichi's great, and going back to her is wonderful, but so many of those Marxist feminists and other feminists were going back to thinking the thickness of reproduction as a category. And if I were to map the new directions in that area, one which I feel a certain loyalty to, I would say that it's more around in vivo labor than around the new work that's really is about biocapitalism and about the exploitation of reproduction in the body itself and the commodification of life itself. So there's just, it's interesting because I kind of wonder about the politics of how we tell the story of these openings. And what I felt to be the impulse behind this 5-point map that you gave was to, which I share, the impulse is to say, oh great, it's all relevant again. And there's all this exciting work going on. But I wonder when we do that, what happens to a kind of more careful genealogy of the work in the trenches, especially among black radicals and feminists, around these areas of questioning.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I can only do so much here in this
format.
And
I understand.
And I was trying to do a lot of signaling. The one thing I was trying to do a lot of signaling about that, both in terms of naming names, but also saying like there's readers being made at every moment, and there's this recirculation. I think that I agree with what you're saying, but I also think internal to black political and feminist political traditions there was an occlusion, whether it's because inside the academy the rise of various post-structuralisms, or outside the academy because of various pressures to turn to a more reformist and less revolutionary politics. So I think for those groups of people, it would be fair to say that you could use the word revival as well. And then...
is it a revival or maybe it's a reception? Reception has changed. I mean, I guess, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I didn't want to waste all of y'all's time doing the kind of auto-genealogizing that I was reflecting on. It's really sensitive of you to notice that. I mean, I thought literally as I opened this laptop and started watching the cursor look like, who is the we I'm talking about? Like, some group of people who are roughly like me, a little bit not like me. But I thought, well, if I do the Sartrean thing, trying to like tell the genealogy of my like class trajectory, or whatever, like why I'm the we here, I'm not sure how interested everybody would have been in that, but it's an important piece, like in a broader conversation for sure. So, yeah, I feel like there was one other tiny little thing I wanted to say about biocapitalism. I think that, at least as you characterize it in passing, part of what's interesting to me is that, like, I mean, that work seems super important to me too, and that's partly what Laura Briggs's work is covering, I think, and expanding on. But in passing also, like, I think part of the interest of some of these conversations, where they either are going or potentially going, is like not only using commoditization as the measure or the index of like what capital is doing, like that's going on all the time, but like the commoditization of our smiles, if our labor is feminized in the surface sector or a certain way, the commodification of our reproductive organs, like it's really terrifying to think about. But some of the conversations from like the 90s into the aughts felt like they were so focused on commoditization as the vector of the problem that these conversations feel fresh and interesting for taking just a breather from that for a second. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, one small point and then a bigger question. Assad Hayer was here recently.
Oh, yeah.
Came through town.
As part of Red May? Or,
yeah. It was a couple of days, last week. So
So
anyway, he was talking about Bacon's Rebellion. And you had mentioned that the alliance between white capitalists and the white workers took place in Reconstruction, but his point was that that alliance seemed to have taken place around 1676. So do you think that's a fair estimate, a fair statement?
I don't know. I think it's a point on the map of like our historical understanding of certain fractures and alliances. So again, I wouldn't want to come up with a categorical answer to your question. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I haven't read Assad's new book yet, and so I don't know its
Good.
or like what the context is for him making that argument.
Okay.
You had a bigger thing that you wanted to say.
The bigger question is, so you talk about the Reserve Army, and Annie talked about the Reserve Army, et cetera, and the idea that they're just as important as wage laborers, who's excluded from wage labor, et cetera. And then we have the question of racial capitalism, we have the question of robotics, et cetera. What do you see happening to what appears to be the formation of a larger and larger surplus population that capitalism can't absorb? What do you see is happening there?
Well, again, like that scholarship by Michelle Alexander and Ruth Gilmore is really important in this regard. Is the big thing in North America that we're going to be talking about is the prison industrial complex, right? It's like one thing that's happening is the making permanently excluded, permanently excluded but hyper exploitable, right? So the whole question of prison labor is part of this too. So that's not an absolute exclusion, because whether you're talking about, I don't know, phone banking or call work that's coming out of prisons, or government piecework or whatever, it's not an absolute exclusion from wage or exclusion from productive labor. But the first thing I would think of is just the dynamics of exploitation in prison populations.
But that's only 2 to 3 million people in the United States.
But
that's a huge number,
yeah,
but it's also, not 50 million.
But I'll permit myself, maybe Assad would like this, I'll permit myself to be a Foucauldian for 2 seconds and say that something like what's going on in prison populations is also laboratorial. That is to say, it's an experiment by the capitalist classes in how to lightly do that to the rest of us. And that seems to me to be one way we could begin thinking about work like Ruth Gilmore's in relation to what Annie's going to present tonight around like intermittent work and gig work. You know what I mean? There's like a staggered continuity between these kinds of labor that I think we're beginning to be able to see as linkable across differences that we wouldn't otherwise notice. This is like a political and rhetorical question. You know what I mean? Like, we've been trained to be respectful of the specificities of different kinds of struggle, and that seems like a good and powerful thing. So we can end up feeling shy about too lazily or equatingly say like, hey, your struggle is like my struggle. But there are granular and historical ways in which it's probably important to begin acknowledging that, even though the material circumstances of those different forms of struggle mean that we are really different kinds of people than the they who we suddenly start to recognize our strange similarities to. This came up in a really interesting context over the last year around a graduate student-led hunger strike at Yale. And you can imagine some of the things that graduate students would be struggling for: better health insurance, a living wage. Do any of you know about the politics of what's been going on at Yale? Anyway, Yale in particular has had a really vivid and intense struggle over graduate student unionization for like 30 years now, and Yale has always pushed back really hard on that. But the interesting twist here was that there was a dean of humanities, an English professor like me, named Amy Hungerford, who wrote this really impassioned editorial in maybe the Yale Daily. I forget the platform when she gave her things about this, but chastening from what she took to be the left of these graduate student workers, chastening them for appropriating the tactics of the dispossessed, that is to say, the hunger strike.
Huh.
And so kind of wagging her finger for an inappropriate traversal of the boundary between comparative privilege in the first world and, say, name your group of people who might at any given moment be hunger striking under much more violently suppressed circumstances. And there was a really beautiful editorial or essay by a friend, comrade of mine named Tim Kreiner. Did any of you read Tim's response to Amy Hungerford? Was it Viewpoint? Do you recall where it was? Or like? Oh, was it really like LA Review Books? Okay. But I highly recommend Tim's piece because it's an interesting volley and an attempt to say, like, I understand that I'm not a Bangladeshi factory worker. And that those people's lives are incredibly, steeply, violently different from mine. But we also, in some strange ways, have common enemies. And the differential types of exploitation to which we are subject does not mean we have no relation to them. And he said it much better than I just did, and really powerfully. Other people are saying similar things, and I think it's worth an attention to that right now. So anyway, go read Tim's piece. It's great.
Well, maybe apropos of that, just to come back, because I'm kind of trying to sort out what's making me sort of pull back around the question of revival as a descriptive for these emergent areas. And maybe it's that account, this map that you give of these 5 areas is really about theoretical inquiry and historical inquiry, and not about movement politics, in which all these things are being organically theorized in really complex ways.
Yes.
That have a sort of different history that can also be told alongside of all of this.
Absolutely.
As well. And so it's also a way of creating a lens onto the way in which we understand questions of value that's actually only receivable within a certain set of contexts. So therefore, the difference between a hunger strike in one location and a hunger strike in another location.
That's another really, sensitive and thoughtful question. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Are you an academic?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is this presenting on W.B. Du Bois on...
And on biocapitalism, 2 different presentations.
I'm sorry, I won't be here.
On the 26th at 4 o'clock at Gay City, I think.
Oh, yeah?
Or it's 2 o'clock at the theater. Are you here?
At the end of May?
I'll have to look at your... Anyway, look at the Renee Seattle.
Yeah.
26.
But
she's also in a
just
Mobilizing Utopia panel by W. Du Bois is relevant.
The questions are also coming from the fact that I'm actually teaching the Marxism survey right now, the undergraduate survey, and I'm really fascinated by the intensive interest right now of undergraduate students in taking Marxist theory. In fact, I had to move the course to a large lecture theater in order to accommodate all the students that were coming to take the course.
That's so great to hear.
Yeah.
And so
and they're all required to attend Red May.
Well, that's amazing.
It's amazing, but it pushes us to really imagine what it is that is the draw right now and how we map that. It seems just really important.
So, I felt like this must go well a little bit from what you were saying.
Sure.
For some of the same reasons I knew all of this. And so, it did seem to come from such a specific lived experience.
Yeah.
And I do like that idea of that in parallel with how it's experienced by people that aren't in that.
For sure. I wanted to say this a little. Yeah, no, thank you. I wanted to say this a little at the beginning, but I didn't want to seem falsely or anaphylactically self-deprecating, but I'm just some guy, who has been in the traffic patterns of certain kinds of people at certain times and places, reading certain kinds of things. Self-genealogizing and self-situating is important work. It's important feminist work, it's important anti-racist work, it's important work inside and outside the academy. I'm not from, like so many of the people gradually I have realized that I work with are a family of academics. My parents aren't professors. This isn't innate to me. I had to kind of laboriously train myself to dovetail my excitements with certain kinds of vocabularies and modes of inquiry and modes of self-critique and self-chastisement, some of which were native to me as a Catholic, some of which were not. I got shame really well because of that, because of being queer. But so it's a slightly different conversation, to try to think carefully about that. I do think for people who live and work inside the academy, students are a really interesting population, not least in public universities, but everywhere. They come from all over. They bring different life experiences, and the reasons that they may be interested in a revival or an activation or a continuation are always more surprising than you would think. And so I have no easy answer, because I think you're pointing to an ongoing project of actually trying to figure out in real time who we are anyway. What does it mean to be a professor using these languages? Kind of categorical question, right? Yes it is, no it's not. Have that fight for 20 years. And then we do more subtle things and more nuanced things about what was the early history of the reception and the production of these things, elite for whom, how does coterie conversation become broader conversation in no one way. And so lately, as I got older, I'm because I worked so hard on some of these things early on, I'm putting the brake on not on my autocritique, but on some of the affects that come with that. And I know you weren't trying to ask about that in particular, but I think it's just ongoing work, and since the academy itself is also a besieged place now, one of the zones, that is to say, where whatever privileges that once accrued to it, they feel much more unstable. Again, in that funny way, it feels like an opportunity there too. Andy, who thinks about, now it's got a name, right? Critical university studies.
So I don't want to stop the conversation, but I'd like to move it for this reason. I was informed by the people, the theater, that the movie they were going to show at 3:30 in Theater 1, the projector isn't working, so they want to move it here. But we could move over into Theater 1 to, have a little more discussion with Chris on this. But I think we got to vacate these premises. But if we don't reconvene together, or it's the next place, let's give Chris a hand.